Welcome back to another episode of Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by a repeat guest, Dr. Andrew Ramey of the USGS Alaska Science Center, to provide an update on the status of highly pathogenic avian influenza in North America. With waterfowl seasons well underway in Canada and the United States, listen in to learn how bird flu is impacting ducks and geese, but also non-waterfowl species like raptors, terns, and gannets. Andy also shares with the audience two surprising HPAI detections, one black bear and one dolphin. With that introduction, let's bring in today's guest. Dr. Andrew Ramey, welcome back to the Delta Waterfowl podcast.
Thanks, Joel. I appreciate you having me back.
Yeah, I welcome you back on here. I don't have that many repeat guests, but welcome back is the right word.
Thanks,
Just
Joel.
quick there for the listener, two things. Dr. Andrew Ramey goes by Andy. We established that one. I said, what does your mom call you? And he says Andy, so we're going with Andy. But I guess the other one is, for those that do listen to the Delta Waterfowl podcast regularly, Andy was on episode 30. It released on April 5th earlier this year, and we talked about a really merging kind of hot topic issue. Still, it was hot then, hot now. It's highly pathogenic avian influenza as it relates to migratory birds. We talked a little bit about human health as well, but we brought you on as an expert to help us and to help duck hunters just kind of understand this emerging issue. Avian influenza has been around for a long time. Obviously, some things have changed here. But Andy, before we get in that, again, why don't you do a real quick introduction about your title, where you work, who you work for?
Sure. Thanks, Joel. So I'm a research geneticist and the director of the Molecular Ecology Lab at the USGS Alaska Science Center in Anchorage, Alaska.
That's fantastic. And you have years of experience dealing with avian influenza. Can you give just a quick overview of, kind of your professional pedigree on this topic?
Sure. So I've been working with avian influenza and wild birds for about 15 years now at the Alaska Science Center, and that includes work I did as part of my PhD on this topic.
Okay, great. Before we get going here, or we get too far into an update, this is really an update podcast talking about what has happened or changed with the high-path avian influenza scene since we had this conversation in April. But can you give the listener just an overview of high-path avian influenza and why we're concerned about it as a waterfowl community?
Absolutely. A good question, Joel. So highly pathogenic avian influenza was historically a poultry disease. That is, prior to 2002, almost all instances of highly pathogenic avian influenza emerged in poultry and affected domestic poultry. But since 2002, this viral disease has become more common in wild birds. In fact, it was only in 2014 and 2015 with a few cases in 2016 that highly pathogenic avian influenza affected wild birds here in North America. This is becoming a emergent disease in North American wild birds. With recent detections starting in December 2021, highly pathogenic avian influenza has been fairly widespread within the United States and Canada since December 2021 in the last numerous months, and has affected more wild birds than here in North America than ever before, more species than ever before, and in a wider geographic area as compared to before.
So earlier in the 2000s, avian influenza had begun to be detected in wild waterfowl populations, both ducks and geese?
Both ducks and geese, swans as well, and primarily in Eurasia.
Okay. So the concerns then, though, were that, asking this a question, it may come across as a statement, but the concern then, when it first emerged in North American waterfowl populations, was that waterfowl would spread avian influenza to domestic poultry operations, etc., right?
That's correct. Yep. I think that still is a concern. I mean, highly pathogenic avian influenza remains an important disease threat to domestic birds. That is, highly pathogenic avian influenza tends to cause mortality among domestic birds and is extremely economically costly, both to individuals with backyard birds and to the poultry industry.
Okay. Right, and that makes sense. Waterfowl being a vector for disease transmission, in this case, avian influenza, transmission. But the difference with this one, right, which is why we had you come on in April, was that if I'm right, for the first time, waterfowl were negatively affected from the virus, right? And symptoms up to and including death.
Yeah, so in 2014 to 2016, there was a little bit of disease witnessed in wild birds, but I mean, we're talking approximately 100 cases in North America during that particular outbreak in those years, as compared to this go around, that is since December 2021, the USDA and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has confirmed or suspected approximately 3,500 cases among wild birds here in North America, and that's of birds that have been tested.
Yeah, I think that's an important one here. One of the things that I hear, either through personal conversations or you might see it in comment boxes on social media, they're saying, when you hear the 3,000 birds confirmed, yeah, the distinction there is those are just the ones that are tested. And so, yeah, people might have encountered a wetland with 50 dead snow geese on it. Hey, they could have succumbed to other diseases or natural mortality events. Quite likely it was avian influenza given the circumstances, but has anyone ever attempted to speculate on the number of mortality events as a result of HPAI?
So, Joel, I haven't seen any good estimates across North America to date. No, I guess I haven't seen any extrapolations here for North America as part of this outbreak, but your comments are spot on. That is, I think the denominator, if you will, that we have of roughly 3,500 birds is likely far fewer than the number of birds that have been affected. And also, like you mentioned, just because birds are dying, we can't say conclusively it was or was not highly pathogenic avian influenza. I mean, there are certainly instances that are more suspicious than others, if you will. We know that wild birds die for many different reasons, and so just because a person observes a dead wild bird, can't assume that it was or was not avian influenza.
In that, that April timeframe, March-April timeframe, there was obviously a massive mid-continent population of lesser snow geese migrating through the heart of our country, both the central and the Mississippi flyways. People, lots of reports of people seeing dead or dying snow geese, a very conspicuous white bird that's quite easy to see against the contrast of a black dirt stubble field, or it's just quite easy for people to see those. We did get you on the podcast. We talked about the issue. At that time, Andy, you had said that, the science of the day didn't lead us to be overly worried about population level declines of waterfowl. Has any of that changed, or are we still kind of in that data collection wait and see mode?
I mean, I think we're still collecting data, Joel, perpetually collecting data. That's what we do as scientists. But I think as the data is coming in, we're finding that lots of the waterfowl that are affected are live birds or birds that are subclinical, that is, they're not showing signs of disease. Although that's not always the case. Obviously, it's happened with snow geese and also with a fair number of Canada geese and cackling geese and black brant, for that matter. There is certainly some level of mortality. Some mortality has also been observed among ducks, as you mentioned. The numbers of birds that are being witnessed to show disease and to die doesn't seem tremendous in comparison to the number of these individuals in the continental populations. I'm not detecting any clear early signals of population level concerns for waterfowl at this time. I think maybe a difference would be some other birds that predate on waterfowl or that share the habitats with waterfowl. There are some species that are showing a strong mortality response. One that's been commonly detected as infected with highly pathogenic avian influenza, proportionally that is, would be bald eagles. I think as many listeners might be aware, bald eagles are sometimes scavengers, sometimes predators on waterfowl, and there's been a fair amount of mortality detected among bald eagles. Whether or not there's going to be a population decline, I'm not in a position to say, but there does seem to be a fairly strong mortality response in bald eagles and some other raptors too. So I think we're still collecting some data, but I think there's some data points, if you will, that are definitely warrant some careful scrutiny, and maybe not necessarily, waterfowl may not necessarily gravitate to the top of that list right now, but maybe some of the species that interact with waterfowl do.
Okay. No, that's interesting. I hadn't really heard much about that one, and I think it kind of leads me into the next phase of the discussion. Is when we were talking, the heart of the northward migration was we were in the middle of that massive south to north migration movement. When we were talking, we knew that. Well, I think we don't know anything. We speculated that we were perhaps going to enter more of a quiet period of talking, people interacting with avian influenza, simply because the time of year, the breeding season events were about to happen. One, birds are going to inhabit areas that people do not, right? Northern Canada, Alaska, more rural areas of prairie Canada, prairie US. But then also during the breeding season, ducks tend to occupy territories. They're not in large flocks. And so I think the thought is that maybe transmission rates would go down, or the fact that we just wouldn't be able to detect them because they are in places that people aren't. What's been going on, Andy, since April? Give us just an overview of what's going on in the world.
Sure. I think you outlined that really nicely, Joel. I appreciate that. Just as you recount, I think the breeding season went off largely per normal, and birds spread out. And when I say normal, that's maybe with through the lens of avian influenza, and that we expect birds to spread out. And just as you say, there tends to be lower levels of detection, less evidence of active infection among avian influenza during that breeding season. And there were certainly detections of highly pathogenic avian influenza at many different areas in North America during that period, but they were largely sporadic detections. There weren't, and from a waterfowl perspective, really large die-offs for most of the continent. But interestingly, there were still some detections. I should point out that during this breeding season, most of the efforts to test for highly pathogenic avian influenza was based on morbidity and mortality reports. What this means is people reporting sick or dead birds. And so there's a strong bias there, and the birds being tested, that is, it's only those birds that are sick or have died, and it's only in places where they're being observed by people. And as you recount, many birds nest in areas with really low population densities, as is the case, for example, through much of the state of Alaska, in which I live and work. It's interesting that there were still detections during this time, so we know that highly pathogenic avian influenza didn't really go away per se during this time. It's still at some level being maintained among wild birds and also in the environment. It's only more recently that folks here at the USGS, USDA, and certainly other institutions and agencies across North America are starting to sample live birds, that is, birds, for example, captured as part of banding efforts, and also hunter-harvested birds. Duck season, waterfowl season opens in Alaska here on September 1. We work closely with hunters in Western Alaska in order to sample hunter-harvested birds. I think the data coming in is starting to change, where now we're going to start to sample birds that may be apparently healthy, that is, those captured through banding operations, and also that seemingly seem apparently healthy when they're harvested by hunters.
Okay, you're intimately familiar with those data collection opportunities in Alaska. Are they occurring across other areas of Canada or the United States that you're aware of, or about to happen?
Yes, and indeed, they are happening.
I'm aware of obviously some of the pre-hunting season banding efforts, banding stations. I'm guessing there's testing going on at a lot of these different locations.
Yeah, I can't speak to any given station, but absolutely there is testing of birds that are being handled as part of banding operations, as well as hunter-harvested birds.
This would be more of a monitoring effort?
Yeah, I mean, the term I think is often used for these programs is surveillance, but yes, it's monitoring, if you will.
Okay, a lot of the data are being collected. Probably isn't a lot to share at this moment in time, a little bit premature.
Yeah, I think most of that information is pending, but refer listeners to the USDA website. They report all confirmed detections, and there have recently been detections in live sampled ducks recently, for example.
Live at banding stations? Is that where they're coming from?
I'm not sure where these most recent detections, exactly the nature of how they were captured or handled, but again, all this information is publicly available, it's online, and they're reported as being live birds.
Okay, I think there's going to come a point in time, Andy, where you will have a pretty robust data set in hand, and we'll bring you back on. I'm not sure if that's a month from now or 2 months from now, but I'd like to see this as a continued conversation where you help Delta keep, our members and waterfowl hunters kind of up to speed on how things are going, what they should know, what precautions they can take. In that line of thinking, Andy, when we spoke on the phone last week, you shared with me some pretty interesting detections of avian influenza in non-waterfowl species or non-duck and goose species. I think you mentioned a dolphin?
Yeah, there was a dolphin that came up Florida recently. There was also a black bear that came up positive in Quebec. Maybe it should be noted that throughout this outbreak, there's been numerous spillovers, if you will, in wild mammals throughout North America. Still to be seen if these are really rare events or if this is maybe a sign of things to come. But at this point, there's been relatively few detections in wild mammals, but they are occurring.
Curious. Avian influenza is normal. It's been around for a long time, but we're talking about high path avian influenza is what has us concerned. So when you're talking about a black bear, you're talking about a dolphin. Are we talking about high path strains?
These detections were highly pathogenic avian influenza, but I do maybe think it's important to mention here that when we talk about high path avian influenza versus other avian influenzas, that high pathogenicity really refers to its effects on domestic poultry. That's what there's a technical definition through a specific test, and that again that high pathogenicity terminology means that it kills domestic birds. This particular type of virus that's being detected in North America also happens to be killing wild birds, but it's not, this high pathogenicity doesn't necessarily mean that it causes severe disease in wild mammals, for example. It may or it may not. So maybe just getting into the weeds a little bit there, but I thought it important to clarify.
No, I think that's a really important distinction. Black bear or a dolphin with high path avian influenza. High path, that's an attribute of domestic birds. So can you speak to were there symptoms that either of those, the bear or the dolphin were expressing, or is it just they were just tested as carrying it?
I'm not intimately familiar with either of these cases. I know there's great information available online, so I can't speak to whether it was determined to be the cause of death, so to speak. But there are certainly cases of wild mammals that were displaying signs of disease throughout this outbreak.
Okay. Another question from last time is that when we were talking about, does this seem to be something that we should be concerned about the integrity of waterfowl populations? And at the time, and you just revisited it, not yet. But you did say that one of the things to keep an eye on were lower population bird species, that maybe if they started experiencing mortality events, that it would be of a population level concern. Talking outside of ducks and geese right now, are there any species of wild birds that are experiencing mortality events that are on people's radar screen?
I think absolutely there are. I mentioned before raptors. I think there's a good deal of concern among the greater natural resource community about what this could mean for some raptor populations. I think terns have been hard hit at various places here in North America and around the world. I think currently in the northeast areas of North America, eastern Canada, there's been significant die-offs and mortality among various seabird species, such as northern gannets. I think there's some concern there what highly pathogenic avian influenza could mean for various species of seabirds. I still think this is something that's prudent to keep an eye on and to pay attention to population numbers in the context of what's going on with highly pathogenic avian influenza. Absolutely.
That's really important. I think a lot of this stuff is we're allowing our listeners to have their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world of HPAI, bringing it maybe to the human level. Again, last time I believe it was the CDC said that this was not, an emerging human issue, but did advise some precautions to take. I think don't smoke, don't do those types of things while you're out in the field. Has any of that changed from the human perspective, human risk, human concern perspective?
Yeah, I definitely want to encourage all listeners to get their information on potential human health implications of highly pathogenic avian influenza to get it directly from the CDC. But I did go to their website today, and as I understand it, they're still reporting that risk to human population health is low. Again, as I gleaned from the CDC website, they're still reporting only a single case in the United States that occurred during the spring and involved a very mild disease and a person fully recovered. The CDC does have a hotline people can call to get information, 1-800-CDC-INFO. So I encourage folks, if they have concerns, to call that number and get information from the CDC. And there's also some other organizations that have put out guidance for hunters, including US Fish and Wildlife Service and the USDA. And some of those specific precautions that they mention in their online materials consistently are things that we talked about last time, Joel, and I think many hunters will be familiar with. Things like avoiding the harvest of sick and dead birds, washing their hands with soap and water immediately after handling game, wearing disposable gloves when dressing game, and cooking meat to an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, that's a funny one. I'm not going to ask you to comment on that one, but when I tell people 165 degrees, they say you just ruined that duck. Because I think that's one of the things that we talk about in the absence of avian influenza this is my editorial here, I think ducks are one of the often miscooked, right? They're overcooked, boot leather, tough, and to me, yeah, I recommend that people cook their waterfowl, more to that medium rare level. But in this case, 165 degrees, cook it all the way through, make sure you're safe. You introduced me, probably Chris, last time, and the listener to fomites. You tell us what a fomite is.
Sure. So I consider a fomite to be an inanimate object, a non-living object, if you will, on which a virus could be spread. So I think we were maybe talking in the context of influenza viruses are able to maintain for a long period of time in cold water. And so I think we were maybe talking about how there's potential that hunters or people recreating in wetlands could potentially spread virus through the movement of wet items, if you will. And I think that's maybe where we're talking about fomites.
Yeah, common fomite waders, I suppose. Walk into the wetland, get your waders wet, you bring it back home. We did talk about different things like that. And I think it's important to note at the background of all this is, I'm going to say, a multi-billion-dollar, maybe I would imagine it's perhaps that high economically, but a multi-billion-dollar domestic poultry operation that I guess most every consumer in the world depends on at least 1 or 2 days a year, if not on a regular basis. That's really at the heart of it. So as hunters, we go afield. Yes, we could act as a vector. So I think that's the chief concern when we're talking about, I guess, from the domestic poultry operation, is that a hunter goes afield, somehow comes in contact with HPAI, and becomes a vector, basically bringing that virus back into contact with stopping at the 4-H barn, or stopping over at your neighbor's turkey farm, having a beer and telling hunting stories. That would be that transmission or vector opportunity. How long does a HPAI persist? So if I have it on my waders, it sounds weird to talk like that, but if I have it on my waders, how long will it persist on my waders?
So I don't have an answer to that specific question, Joel, and that I've never done any kind of experiment where we infected waders, but we have done experiments where we tested how long viruses could be maintained in water naturally occurring in wetlands, surface water, if you will, out in the field, so under field conditions, field temperatures. And in our most recent experiments in Alaska, a very cold place, we found that some proportion of them remain infectious for more than a full year. I mean, these viruses can remain infectious for a long period of time in cold water. That's maybe a good piece of information for hunters to consider.
That's incredible. That's a long period of time. But I guess viruses are not living things. What causes a virus to break down?
Various things can cause viruses to break down. Some that come to mind immediately would be UV radiation. Another one would be heat. There's also chemical interactions that can break down viruses, right? Everybody's well familiar that bleach, for example, breaks down viruses very quickly.
I have mentioned to people kind of a mild bleach solution. I've never mixed one up and used it. And as a result, I would be afraid of ruining all of my hunting gear or clothing by staining it with bleach. When you mix up a mild bleach solution, what's a ratio? Maybe we should send people to Google because you don't want the bill for ruining everybody's clothing. What is a common ratio of bleach to water?
I have no idea what one should use on waders. I mean, we use a pretty strong bleach solution in the genetics lab, for example, where an area where we're worried about contamination. And so we'll make a pretty strong bleach solution at 10%. And that disinfects virus, or it kills viruses very quickly. A 10% bleach solution might be awfully strong for one to apply on their waders. I don't have any recommendation there.
10% would probably bleach your clothing?
I would not put it on my own personal clothing.
There you go. There you go. That's as far as we need to go with that one. Well, Andy, I really appreciate this conversation. I think the purpose of this one, and when you and I spoke on the phone last week and I invited you back on, we concluded this would probably be an update podcast with very few conclusions. But again, I do think this is important information in and of itself, just providing this update, because as you know, like you said, waterfowl hunting season opened in Alaska earlier this month. Hunters in North Dakota have been hunting early Canada geese. Teal seasons are open. So I think a lot of people are wondering. And so I guess I would suggest as a wrap-up that not a lot has changed. We're still collecting data. The crystal ball doesn't allow us to look terribly far in the future. One last thing, though, Andy, that I realized that you had said one thing to keep an eye on is juveniles in the population obviously have, like young children, have no resistance. They haven't been exposed to bacterial or viral infections, therefore they have low resistance. Are you seeing any adult versus juvenile infection rates? Any difference there?
I don't have any data on that yet, Joel. That's something we're just started sampling for on September 1 when waterfowl season opened here in Alaska. That's something that we're very interested in assessing. So it's going to have to be saved for the next update. Maybe as we start to wrap up, I do just want to state that I appreciate that I have still more outstanding questions than answers at this point. And, I ask for your and everybody else's understanding that this is really a pretty unprecedented situation going on these days. That is, the level of detection that we're seeing with highly pathogenic avian influenza in wild birds is unlike anything we've really seen before. So we're doing our best and based on what we know about other influenza viruses that aren't directly comparable necessarily. But with that, I just want to acknowledge that there's still a lot of uncertainty as reflected in lots of my insufficient answers to your queries. But I do want to say that I think hunters might play a really important role and have played a really important role through their reports and through their observations. I really thank hunters for making those observations and particularly for reporting those observations to their local land manager, to their local state veterinarian. I think those reports of sick and dead birds have been extremely helpful for agencies and researchers to understand what's going on, and I really encourage people to keep those reports forthcoming so that we can learn something from this unfortunate event that's unfolding.
Perfect. Very well said. The other thing that we mentioned last time, which I just want to make sure that it's still good words to live by, is that if a hunter encounters a dead bird, leave it there, right? We're not doing anybody favors by pulling it out into your truck and taking it somewhere and throwing it away?
Absolutely. That's a really good point, Joel. I think those reports are very important, but rather than have a person put themselves at any risk, even if it's low risk, I think it's best if they report it to the local land manager, their state veterinarian. There's people that are responding to these events regularly, have proper PPE, have protocols, so that they can gather information systematically, provide that to the testing lab or relevant agency in a consistent manner. So I think it's most important to deliver the information, but we're not asking the public to make any direct steps towards the collection of samples or to move carcasses in any way.
Okay. See something, say something to your local manager, but leave it lie. Good words to live by. Well, with that, Andy, I appreciate it. So I guess for the listener, expect to have this conversation to continue, maybe with some more data and some more emerging trends, things that people should know of and want to know of. Because that's one thing I love about waterfowl hunters, or I think any type of hunter. Yeah, we harvest that resource, but we care about it deeply 12 months a year, not just the month or two that we're afield hunting, whatever it is, whether it's waterfowl or big game. Andy, thank you very much for the time. I know you're a busy guy. Caught you back at your desk for a rare moment, and appreciate you spending it with us.
Thanks, Joel. I really appreciate you having me.
You bet. If anybody has questions in the meantime, we're not giving Andy's email address out, but send that question to podcast@deltawaterfowl.org. Or if you jump on our website, jbrice@deltawaterfowl.org is my email address, and I will pass that question on to Andy. Love any comments, any questions, send them my way. Look for this to be a continued conversation a month or two down the road. Andy, thanks again. Enjoy what's left of your fall, and we'll stay in touch.
All right, thanks, Joel. Look forward to the next time.
Fantastic. Take care.